We're going to come on back to the lectures and talk about the American response to the Great Depression. And we're going to look at how people dealt with it and then how President and Congress are going to deal with it, which is, just to be clear, pretty terribly. They do an absolute terrible job of actually trying to deal with the Great Depression and the problems that come from that. It's pretty embarrassing. And now this is one of the very powerful images from the aptly named Dust Bowl, which is a big part of today's lecture because the Dust Bowl happens right at the same time as the Great Depression. So it's pretty much one of the worst 1-2 punches possible. So yeah, it's pretty rough. This is literally a dust cloud. I know you can't really see it. It looks like maybe trees or something, but this is a wall of dust about to consume this building. So,
how sudden kind of storm was it like
yeah, sandstorms in Oklahoma and Kansas and, yeah, in America, sandstorms. Like 30, 40, 50 feet tall sandstorms that covered millions of acres of land. So people who are experiencing, the Great Depression are now having to deal with all other kinds of things. But to survive the Great Depression, you have to understand what they were dealing with. 25% unemployment, at least. Most that were employed were able to keep their jobs, had to take significant cuts in pay. And so they were saying, hey, will you take a pay cut? And you're like, well, you were barely paying me anything anyways. And they were like, well, you can take a pay cut or you could be fired. So you can either work or have nothing. And so their incomes are going to shrink by as much as a third during the Great Depression. Soup kitchens, charity lines, these things were things that were previously for the lower class. The handouts were for people of lower class. And now it really extended all the way into the middle class, really the upper middle class, which is pretty much unheard of. And that's really because a very big chunk of the population really just had nothing. They had lost everything. The soup kitchens are unable to meet this growing demand for food. And, it's pretty awful. The people in the middle class, they can't even get food now. And so you have these people that are like really well educated, but they're having to take these odd jobs. Like one of the professors at NYU in New York City starts driving taxis. I mean, to think that a college professor would be driving taxis is kind of a crazy thing, but you kind of had to because of this. You had to get side jobs. You had to, it is pretty indicative of just how terrible things were. People were so poor and hungry that they would go and go to landfills and try and find scraps of food. And this is things that you think of like third world countries being and doing. It utterly dwarfs anything that has happened since then. And unfortunately, it was just a terrible time for America. The 2008 economic crisis, really put some people in binds, but that was mostly like bankers. It did extend to the middle class. A lot of people saw their retirement savings go kaput and have to shift their retirements and work longer than they wanted to, but nothing to the extent of the Great Depression. People look for ways to make money. They start growing their own gardens to grow their own food. Criminal activity really skyrockets during this time. People found creative ways to get jobs, right? There was actually some people in the state of Washington that would go out and light forest fires so that they could go volunteer and get paid by the fire department to go put them out. Yeah, that's not good. You just set the forest on fire so that you can go get paid to put them out. This is a photo taken by a woman named Dorothea Lange. It's one of the most iconic images from the Great Depression era. And the woman is Florence Thompson. She's shown with her children. And they were migrant farm workers in California. She finds herself there because she's originally from the Midwest. She starts fleeing the dust storms in Midwest Texas and Nebraska and Oklahoma. And all these places are hit extremely hard by the dust because you basically end up with this huge drought plus a bunch of wind plus terrible farming techniques. And it leads to a economical, disaster. The industry, because agriculture falls so far, meat prices go up. And from the 1910s and 1920s, there's a demand for, agriculture, but there's no way to grow it. So they overfarm it in Oklahoma and Texas. They plow up millions of acres of grassland. They plant wheat and corn and all these things. They're thinking, we're going to get rich. And then the prices fall, and then the rain stops coming. And so they dig up even more land. And by the time they end up digging up all this land and taking all the grass and all the trees off the land, and you know that like the Great Plains is very windy, so now you've plowed it all up, planted stuff, there's no rain, so nothing's growing, but you have millions and millions of acres of plowed up farmland, and then the wind comes and just takes just ridiculous numbers of sand and stuff and blows it all over the place. And you can see here, this is another picture. So these storms, prairie grass that would basically hold it down is gone. It's leading to erosion. And so people end up with these incredible, dust storms covering the country. People end up with like drought pneumonia or dust pneumonia, which is basically you breathe in so much dirt and silt that your lungs fill with mud. Literally. Yeah. Lots of people would die from this, hundreds if not thousands. Then a terrible storm hits. May 11th of 1934, during the middle of the Great Depression, this dust storm was 2 miles high. It was the storm of Black Sunday, 2 miles high, and traveled 2,000 miles from all the way to the East Coast. So it starts in Oklahoma. This dust storm kicks up 2 miles high. It deposits sand all the way to New York City. So much sand that actually standing in New York City, you could not see the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, in New York Harbor. So you're talking about a lot of dirt. That was pretty terrible, but it wasn't even the worst one. So you had as much as 3 million tons of topsoil are estimated to have been blown off of the Great Plains, where people were trying to plant, and then all that dirt was just taken and deposited all over the country. It's estimated that 30 million acres of cultivated farmland had become useless because of the Dust Bowl. 30 million acres. And that another 125 million acres had suffered from the drought, which is roughly about 3/4 of the size of Texas. Had got to the point where maybe the topsoil didn't blow off, but there was so little rain, nothing could be grown there. And they were afraid that it was going to get to the point that if the drought did not end, which had started in like 1924, 25, that essentially the middle of the country might become basically like the Sahara Desert forever. That's kind of where it was heading. Luckily, after about 14, 15 years of less than like 20 inches of rain a year, the rains finally returned. But the land is not going to recover and be able to have nutrients for crops and be able to sustain crop growing for another, 15, 20 years after that. I mean, it's really hard to describe it, how terrible the Dust Bowl actually was. And so, even after World War II, the stock market recovers and the New Deal and all this stuff. Everything's getting better, but the middle of the country where the Dust Bowl was really the most significant, again, not till the late 1950s do they really get back to normal. Right? And so it's pretty impressive and important to kind of look at that. The next major event is how America is going to react to the Great Depression, and this is going to deal with what's called the Bonus Army March of 1932. And the story actually starts, as many historical events do, with events that took place several years or decades in this case, before. So this goes back 7 years to 1924. It is, it's 6 years after the end of World War I. And at this point, the U.S. government had promised the war veterans work, and that World War I veterans were going to receive a bonus check from the federal government for their service in World War I. But the problem was that the bonuses would not actually be issued until like a decade later. So they're going to get this bank payoff, right? They have all those bonds. They've got to pay off the bonds. But then they say, hey, 10 years after the war ends and all this stuff, like, we're eventually going to get you your bonus checks and don't worry about it, right? So World War I ends. They go and they say, hey, we want our bonus checks. And they go, well, we can't. We don't have the money for it. Sorry, you're just going to have to wait. Well, now it's 1932, the Great Depression set in, and these Army veterans are like, hey, we really need that money now. We are poor, we're broke, and y'all owe us those checks. So we need you to get that to us. And so basically, they're going to actually go and march on Washington. This guy starts in Portland. They decide, hey, we're going to go to Washington, D.C. and demand our checks, right? And they board a train and they travel all the way to Washington, D.C., which is like a 3,000-mile trip during the Great Depression, which is not easy to do. And he basically, along the way, a bunch of these other veteran groups around the country kind of hear about what's happening, and they get inspired and they decide they're going to join this group from Portland. By the time they get to Washington, D.C., they are basically an army worth of veterans. And you can kind of see this picture, like they're marching through Washington, D.C. You've basically got the entirety of the World War I veterans army, like saying, hey, we want our money. It's not really a great event because guess what? There's no money to give them. So it doesn't really work out all that well for them. But what they really want is just to be recognized that, like, hey, we fought for this country. You promised us money. We want it. Congress and the president don't really deal with this very well. Herbert Hoover actually refused to even go and meet or talk with the veterans at all. And the Congress creates a delegation. They're going to hear them out. But the senators that hear them out are basically going, hey, we can't give you what we promised. What we can give you is like an IOU that's worth like 50% of what we originally promised you. Because the federal government really can't afford to pay you because we don't have any money either. And so the tensions are going to be very high. And this is going to last, and it's going to take several years to actually work out. I think it's not until like 1945, actually, that the veterans from World War I get their actual full bonuses. Like, until after World War II is over. But when FDR gets elected, there's another bonus march, and he does a little bit more through the New Deal Public Works program and stuff, and he says, hey, I can't give you straight up cash, but I can give you a job. And he does more to employ them, which does subside some of this. But really, this is kind of indicative of all the different groups that had lost their jobs, who were having to suffer because of the decisions of bankers. And as we said, it was only about 10% of people even owned stocks. So you've got 90% of the country. And marches like this, the Bonus Army March of 1932, is really one of those things that just speaks about the controversy of the Great Depression, with the average person and how affected they were in the measure and the length that they were willing to go to get what was owed to them so they could take care of their country or take care of their families. Herbert Hoover, as we can see, he does a really bad job. In the midst of the Great Depression, he basically comes out and says, no, the economy is sound and prosperous. And everybody's like, bro, we can't even eat. What are you talking about? But he just wants to pretend everything's fine. He's probably one of the most ineffective presidents we've ever had. He doesn't do anything. He has the power to fix a lot of these problems, but he just doesn't. And, he steps into the White House at one of the greatest economic growth periods in American history, and it bottoms out within 7 months, and then he does basically nothing because he's like, well, this is not my fault. And as he goes on and stays in denial, the country slips deeper and deeper into this problem, and he's basically unprepared, unequipped to fix any of this, and again comes out and says, oh no, it's sound and prosperous, everybody. Don't worry, this is fine. And he seemed just very disconnected from the real world. And so he was committed to voluntary initiatives, not federal government initiatives. So basically he said, hey, if a group of rich people want to get together and have some social help and put people to work, that's their prerogative, but the government's not stepping in because the government didn't cause this problem, which is just absolutely ridiculous. He believed that the government should not help people fix their own problems, that people should step up and find a way to do it. There you go. The depression escalates, and he never comes up with any solutions that really help at all. You get political cartoonists that just blast him. They're saying, oh, he's like the bad babysitter. He can't even keep children from screaming, whether it's the business depression or the drought damage. He's incapable of fixing anything, and that he's basically ignoring it. He's allowing urban centers to become shanty towns because people are just living in the streets, and he's doing nothing to help these people. He's not helping the farmers. He's not doing any of that. He's not fixing the Dust Bowl. He's basically just trying to put blankets on him and say, quit crying. But he's not doing anything to actually help. He's not rocking it or anything. So it's kind of a political commentary there. So part of the problem is he ran for president under the slogan of, this idea that hey, you should take care of yourself. And he, eventually he's going to succumb to the pressure from American industries. He signed something called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which basically is designed to protect American industry, but it actually backfires. He says, hey, we're going to raise prices on anything bought outside this country, right? And so you have this situation where he says, if we make things created outside the country so expensive that nobody in America wants to buy them, they have to buy American-made products. That'll help American industry, right? Except America, as bad as the Great Depression was in America, it was even worse in Europe. And Europe was really depending on America to help them make it through their own depressions. And so when we stop buying their goods, it bottoms out the global economy. Particularly in Germany. And so, he basically puts Germany on a tee for Hitler to just knock out of the park and take over, because he makes it so bad in Germany that the people there are like, we'll take anybody who promises to make this better, literally. And so he also resisted the Democrats who wanted to provide direct aid to the people. And he basically kept saying, I'm not going to support, the government just giving handouts to people. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And he didn't want to be labeled as a socialist. And you have to understand there's a big difference between having and allowing social programs for poor people that need help and being a socialist. So Obviously, his opponents are going to take advantage of this. They're going to label him a terrible person that only cares about elites. And this label is really going to stick with him and really the Republican Party as a whole for the next 50 years or more, 60 years. That the Republicans only care about elites, industry, and that they don't care about the poor people because they don't want to help them. Because the Democrat Party is able to connect the idea of essentially government assistance, a resistance to just the government helping everybody for nothing with not being for the working class person. And so he does give in a little bit at the end there, but it's really too late, and he ends up getting the crap kicked out of him. In the end, you know, you have the Reconstruction Finance Corps that gives like $1.5 billion to federal loans to banks and insurance companies and industries and trying to prevent bankruptcies, but actually this ends up being seen as even worse because he's saying, hey, well, we're going to get the businesses back on their feet and they're going to get people back working, but then these businesses just take the loans, take all this stuff, and the business owners get rich and never pass it on to the poor people. So again, he gets this label of, well, you just care about the rich and the elite. Then he has the Federal Home Loan Bank System provide loans to homeowners to prevent foreclosures, and that gets so difficult for an average person to actually get a loan that, once again, he's seen as unsympathetic, which is kind of crappy for him, but oh well.